and stltoday.com. Tony Messenger. Tony, I loved your column on Rod Jetton and Eric Greitens. It was really interesting how these two up-and-coming stars sort of have a very similar path so far.
Well, good morning, McGraw. Good morning, Kelly.
Hi, Tony.
It struck me. It's interesting. I hadn't thought of the parallel to Rod Jetton immediately when the Greitens news broke. It took me a while, but I was having a conversation with another reporter, and something they said struck me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, the parallels with Rod Jetton here are amazing. And one of the points that was important for me to bring up is that both cases, Rod Jetton's case and Governor Greitens' case, the parts of their sex scandal cases, they revolve around consent and this idea that really pushes back on the motion to dismiss that was filed by Dowd Bennett in Governor Greitens' case, in which they said, well, the woman was already in the basement, and they knew they were going to have an affair, so, basically everything is free game. Of course, he can take a picture, whatever, it doesn't matter. She already, consented to sex. And both of these cases deal with that concept of consent and the fact that consent is complicated and that there are multiple levels of consent. Listeners who've been around a while and followed the Rod Jetton case will recall that he was accused of sexual assault in a case in which he and his lover agreed to have rough sex.
Yeah.
There was evidence that they agreed to have rough sex, and they agreed to a safe word, green balloons, and ultimately he beat the crap out of this woman.
Yeah.
And consent to sex doesn't mean consent to physical assault.
Right. Apparently, right. She had invoked the word, and he kept going, and that was part of the ultimate argument. What about though? But he ultimately gave up, right? I mean, he ultimately admitted to it, resigned in a disgrace, and went off to rehabilitate his life, right?
Yeah, he was already out of office when most of his problems happened, but he was a very prominent political consultant in Jefferson City, and he closed his business almost overnight after he was charged with assault. And then after the assault came an FBI investigation into his campaign finance stuff. And so that's another one of the parallels that these politicians who seem to have a problem with ethics and seem to have a problem with following the rules, it's a values problem. It's a problem in the core of the individual. It's not just one thing or the other. Ultimately, the FBI investigated Mr. Jetton and some other folks in Jeff City for trying to kill a bill, and they were doing dark money before anybody knew what dark money was. They were moving money around in different committees to try to influence legislation, but doing it in a way to try to hide the source of the money. And ultimately, nobody was ever charged by the feds in that particular case. But it's so ironic that is one of the things that Governor Greitens is accused of, and not just accused of, but clearly does. I mean, he has a dark money committee and won't tell anybody who's given money to that committee, and clearly it could be influencing the flow of legislation in Jefferson City.
Tony, what do you make of the fact, one, talk about ethics. It's a good thing Eric Greitens majored in ethics at Duke.
Yeah, has a degree from Duke in ethics.
But what do you make of Dowd Bennett stepping down from the Confide app? They're still going to represent the governor in this other stuff, but the Confide app was pro bono. It was free. Isn't that some type of lobbyist gift to give a governor free legal advice?
Well, that's where this got very complicated, and most legal observers that I know that I talked to about this case said that there was no way that Bennett could handle both cases, that ultimately they were going to have to recuse themselves. And I think probably if they hadn't, at one point, the attorneys who filed the lawsuit, Mark Pedroli and Ben Sansone, probably would have filed motions to have them recused because their interests are different. They're defending the governor in a criminal case, and then also defending both the governor's office and the custodian of records in the governor's office in a civil lawsuit that might possibly conflict and overlap with the governor's case. So it would seem very unusual for the same law firm to handle the whole thing. And the way it was handled by the Attorney General's office was really strange. The Attorney General recused himself basically because he was also investigating Confide, or at least fake investigating Confide. And so he appointed James Bennett to be to represent the governor's office, but James Bennett wasn't representing the governor's office. Other attorneys in his law firm were representing the governor's office, and that's not what the appointment letter said. So the whole thing was a little bit bizarre, and I think Dow Bennett realized that its own legal reputation is going to have to survive much further than this particular case, and they said, okay, we're going to extract ourselves from that because people are going to raise all sorts of questions.
There's a lot of chatter out there, Tony. You got the investigation going on down in Jefferson City. You have something going on in the city. Now comes word that clearly there's some opposition research on this investigator that Kim Gardner hired, and so there's a war. There's a PR war going on right in front of our eyes. What are you watching? Read the tea leaves for me. What are you watching for next, and what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, first of all, I'm watching for a couple of things. So the Post-Dispatch had a story a couple of days ago about the evidence that had to be turned over in discovery to Governor Greitens' defense team, including some testimony from the victim and phone records from the governor. I look for, if there's stuff in there that exonerates the governor, there to be some leaks there. And if there aren't any leaks there, I will find that interesting. It would tend to make me think that the information there that they turned over as evidence is relatively incriminating. And I continue to look at this, as I look at the war of words between those who are defending the governor and going after Kim Gardner and going after her investigators, and those are some very legitimate stories. The story on the front page of the Post-Dispatch today about how one of her private investigators himself was investigated by the FBI for bigamy at one point. I mean, this story is just amazing. You just can't make this stuff up. But the one thing that I haven't seen from the defenders of the governor who are going after Kim Gardner is any actual defense of the crime that he's being accused of.
Right.
It's mostly an attack the messenger sort of mentality. And, that says something about the strength of their case.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Tony Messenger, Tuesdays and Thursdays with us, stltoday.com. Tony, thanks for checking in.
Good to talk to you.
All right, there you
Bye.
go.